So as I pointed out before, when we were looking at Docker Hub, there's lots of different applications that have already been set up in Docker images and available on Docker Hub. And as I pointed out at the time, one of those types of applications are databases. So you can see here I'm looking at the MySQL official Docker images, but there's a bunch of them. If you want to play with MongoDB, you'll find Mongo images available up here. If you want to play with Postgres, there'll be Postgres images up here. Lots of different databases. You want to do some actually I don't know what to search under, but there's probably even Windows and Linux Microsoft SQL Server images up here. So a bunch of different images you can play with. Now these tend to be a little bit more complicated than just running up a Linux image, but they can be really useful. Very common, for example, in if you're a Delphi developer and you're using FireDAC or whatever database library, not uncommon that you need to test your application against multiple different versions of databases or even multiple types of databases. Maybe your application supports MySQL and also Microsoft SQL. Some of your customers are using one, some are using the other. So I guess you could maintain VMs with different versions of each of those available, or for your development and testing you could just use Docker. Nice and simple. And so that's what we're going to do here. I'm going to do a few different examples. We're going to have a look at a couple of different versions of MySQL. We'll also have a look at using Postgres as well. But just to introduce you, partly to introduce you to the idea that one totally valid use for Docker in development is for running databases, but also to introduce you to a few more features of Docker. So let's have a look. Let's say I want to use this MySQL image. And like before, we can see the different versions that are available listed as tags. And if you go to the tags page, you'll be overwhelmed with the number of different versions that you can use. I'll probably just play with 5.7, this tag. And maybe also latest. Why don't we do one of both, just so you can see that once you figure it out, what all of the different settings required are. Once you've got that figured out, it's really easy to switch between and test against different versions of the same database. Now, we're going to use ports like we have in previous examples. We're also going to use volumes like we have in previous examples. But the additional feature of Docker that we're going to use is the ability to override environment variables. So if we have a look in this description of MySQL, if we scroll down a bit, you'll see, here we go, this Docker image has been set up with a number of environment variables. So MySQL in this Linux container is going to go looking for these named environment variables and use it for different settings. So for example, it grabs its root password out of this MySQL _root_ password environment variable. It uses this MySQL _database as the name of the database to be created on image startup. So for example, if we wanted to set the startup MySQL but have a particular value in the root password so that we can log into it, well, we want some way to be able to set this environment variable from outside. From my Mac, I want to be able to start up a Linux container based on this MySQL image, but say this environment variable MySQL root password should have this value of Fred. So then when I go to log in as root, I can use the password of Fred and we're all happy. So let's have a look at how we might start up MySQL. Now the scenario I'm doing, like I mentioned before, is that I'm a developer on our Delphi application, and we need to be able to test against a couple of different versions of MySQL and maybe also Postgres. So I want to be able to start up this MySQL container and point it at my database files that my application is expecting. Yeah. If we have a look in my demos directory, I've got in here a folder called db_mysql. Yep. And this is all I've really done is I've grabbed the Secula DB, which is kind of like a fairly standard test database for MySQL. Yeah. And I've got the schema, the .sql file for the schema, and I've got the .sql file for the actual data that I want loaded into it. Yeah. So when I start up this container, I also, in addition to telling it what the root password is, I also want to be able to tell it here, create this database, load up this example data so that when I connect to it, there's some meaningful data in it. Yeah. Well, again, the MySQL guys have thought of this. So if you scroll down the environment variable section, here we go, initializing a fresh instance. If you read through this, it basically tells you that if you when it starts up, it will look in this folder inside the container called docker entry point initdb.d. Yeah, and any SQL files that it finds in there will be executed on startup of MySQL. Yeah, so as long as I put my SQL files in there, and it's going to do them in alphabetical order. So as long as I make sure that my SQL file for creating the database structure is alphabetically earlier than my SQL file for populating the data, I should be able to have that created for me at startup. Yeah. So let's take a shot at this. I think we now know enough to be able to do this. So it'll be the same command as before, docker container run. Yeah. Now, I want to set a few of these environment variables. Yeah, the first one I want to set is that one that we looked at, which was this MySQL root password. Yeah, I'm going to log in as root. I could use these, MySQL user and MySQL password, but just for the purposes of the demo, let's use MySQL root password. Okay. So from the Docker command line, I can set environment variables, yeah, using the -e param. So I can say -e, what's the password here? There, the environment variable, there it is. So MySQL underscore root password equals, and what do I want the root password to be? Yep, I'll just make it root pw. Yeah, so that's the first one. Second one, I want it to create a database, yeah, which is this one, this MySQL database environment variable. Name of a database to be created on image startup. Yeah, so let's do that one. So again, -e, MySQL database equals, and I'm just going to give it a name of Secula, because that was the name of my imaginary applications database that I want to have created. Okay, so I've set the root password, I've told it to create a database. Awesome. Well, I'm going to be connecting remotely to it, so I still need to map its port, just like we did with the web server. Yeah. So normally MySQL, if you have a look through the information in Docker Hub, you'll see that it's listening on port 3306. Yeah. But that's the port inside the container. I want to map that to something on the outside of the container. Yeah. So in my case, I'm going to map it to 3307. Yeah. So my Mac OS port 3307 will effectively tunnel through or map through to the port 3306 on the container. Yeah. What else? Well, it's created the database, but it hasn't populated it with structure or with data. And remember, that's where it goes looking for it in this docker entry point initd file. Yeah. So I want to basically map that so that inside the container, that directory maps out to this Secula DB folder. Yeah. And we've already seen how to do that using volumes. Yeah, so I'll say -v, just like before. The local folder, yeah, which this Secula DB folder underneath, DB MySQL Secula DB, yeah. So I'll say whatever my present working directory is, pwd, okay, DB MySQL Secure DB. Okay, that's the directory on my local machine, in this case on Mac OS. But what should it appear as inside the container? That should be mapped to this Docker entry point initdb.d folder. Yeah. So that's what's going to be inside the container. So that will map to Docker. I should probably just copy and paste this, because no doubt I'll get it wrong. initdb.d. Yeah, I like to think that's right. Again, we're going to start this up just to show you a different way. I'm not going to start up an interactive session with this. I'm going to start it up just as a daemon, as we saw before, so -d. Okay, and the last thing we need to say is we haven't told it what image to use, what Docker image. Yeah, so I'm just going to say MySQL, and I'm going to use the 5.7 tag because I in particular want 5.7. Okay. Now I know that looks like an awful lot. Yeah, like that's nuts, as if you're going to remember that. I don't remember that. I copy it out of another file. Yeah. But the point is, the first time you set this up, you'll have to read through the information on Docker Hub and all the rest of it. But once you've got it, you'll just stick this in a batch file or something like that. Yeah. So you'll have locally a few batch files. Start, to test your application, start MySQL 5.7 bat. Start MySQL latest.bat. Start Postgres, whatever. Yeah. So you'll only really figure this out once and then stick it in a batch file. Yeah. Or you'll have your continuous delivery tool like Jenkins or something start up, run this command to start up the database before it runs your tests or something like that. So even though it looks nuts typing all this stuff in, you're not going to do it repeatedly. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, let's start this up. Now I started it up as a daemon, remember? I did -d. So let's have a look. Docker container list. We can see it's running. Yep, and it's listening on 3307. Okay, so let's copy this ID. And just like before, I want to get, I want to have a look at its logs, because I want to see that it's done all of that stuff. At startup, it created the directory, created the database called Secure, ran my SQL scripts, and I want to see basically that it's ready to go. Now I can see one of the last messages here is that MySQL D is ready for connections, so that's good. But I can scroll back through here and go through and see what happened during startup. Yeah, see whether it created my my database, all that sort of stuff. Yeah. So you can have a look back through the logs, and I'll leave this running actually, so that when I do some other stuff later on, we can see these log files updating. Yeah, but it appears to me that my MySQL database is running. Yeah, so now I've just got a MySQL database running on the network. Yeah, so I can connect to it using FireDAC or whatever your favorite Delphi data access technology is. Yeah, the one thing to realize, I don't know if I said this before, is that my container shares the IP address with the machine it's running on. So in this case, my container is running on my Mac. So it's going to use the IP address of my Mac. So if I want to reference this MySQL instance, it's listening on 3307, but the IP address is going to be the IP of my Mac. Yeah. So if I jump over to, in VMware, I've got running Delphi. Yeah. If I have a look at in the Data Explorer, let's modify this connection and we'll just run through what I've got in here. The server I've got set up as the IP address of my Mac, yeah, where the container is running. Yeah, and the port is 3307, the one I told that I mapped in the command to run my Docker container. Yeah. For MySQL, the root username is root, password is root pw, which is what I used the -e environment variable to set. Yeah, and the database name is Secure. I also used -e, the environment variable, to set that. Yeah, so I should be able to test this and get a connection through to my database. Yeah, but then also I should be able to come in here, see all of those Secure tables that were created. Let's have a look at some of the data. If I view this, That's not a terribly interesting table. Let's have a look at customer. That might be a little bit more. Yeah, here we go. Here's some customer information running inside MySQL 5.7. Yep. So I'm just using Data Explorer here as a substitute for your application, because Data Explorer, in this case, I'm using the FireDAC drivers. Equally, you could use your application's FireDAC drivers to connect. From your application point of view, it's just MySQL. It doesn't know that it's running in a container. It's just MySQL 5.7. Yeah. Now, on that, let's say, let me close this. Okay. Let's say that I also need to test. I get, we've been running against 5.7 for ages. We get a customer contact us and say that they're using our app, but they happen to be using it against the latest version of MySQL. Yeah. Well, I could go and install the latest version of MySQL on a machine somewhere, or spin up a machine in Amazon, or start up a VM, create a VM or something like that. But that's a bit, silly. Yeah. Why don't I just start up a Docker container with the latest version of MySQL, test it, and then when I'm finished with it, chuck it away. Yeah. To do that, I should stop the one that I've already got. I actually don't have to, but let's be tidy. I didn't show you this before, but the way when you start a container with -d, before, when I was creating an interactive session, when I wanted to quit the container, I basically exited the bash shell. Yeah. Well, I haven't started this one up running a bash shell. Yeah, I've started it up and it's running its own entry point, which is basically telling it to start MySQL. So instead, to kill it, I can use Docker container stop, and then I need to give the ID, the container ID, which is this guy. Yeah. So I'll do this. I won't hit enter just yet. When I hit enter, I'll jump across and we'll look at the logs. So, because we should be able to see the logs, the shutdown details of the of MySQL. Yeah. So we can see it running through and shutting down. There it was, ready for connection, and then you can see where it received the shutdown message. Yeah. So you get to see it starting up and shutting down. But now I've got this problem customer that wants to use my application with the latest version of MySQL. Well, now that we've done the hard work of figuring out how to start this is really easy. I just change 5.7 to latest. Yeah, done. Okay. Docker container list, just to make sure it's going. Grab the ID. Let's do look at the logs, just to make sure that it's finished setting up and it's ready for connections. Plugin ready for connections. Here we go. MySQL D is ready for connections. Awesome, but it's version 8.0.19 now. Yeah. And away we go. We can come back in here, go to our MySQL driver, connect, run our application to test, all that sort of stuff. Yeah. So this is one of the values of, to me, I don't care what sort of application you're writing, whether you may not be writing a web app or something like that. But even just using Docker as in development, where you need to spin up multiple databases, you need to spin up a web server, you need to be able to run tests in an environment where you know that the environment is exactly the same as it was last time you ran the tests. Yeah, there haven't been any changes, or there's no leftovers from the last time you ran those tests. Yeah, or you want to test against multiple databases. Yeah, so let's kill this one. Let's do Docker container stop and give it the ID. Okay. Instead of MySQL, let's do Postgres. Yeah. Now, you can come over to Docker Hub and you can you can look up the Postgres image. Okay. Let's have a look. Where are we? So we're going to use this official Postgres image. You can go through and you can look up those same things about, this will be different to MySQL, how to start the instance, how to set the password and user and all that sort of stuff. I've already done that. Yeah. So I'll show you the command, Docker container run, just like before. Okay. Again, we're going to use environment variables because it also uses environment variables to set these things. Yeah. So let's do that. We're going to set the password different to MySQL, kind of the same idea, but different specific environment variables. But I'll set it to the same thing. So the password is going to be root password. The database that I want it to use is going, or that I want it to create, I should say, is going to be Secular. Okay. I need to map the port again. The port that Postgres sort of normally listens on is 5432. So I'm going to map that. So it normally listens on 5432. That's what it's listening on inside the container. Outside the container, I can map that to something else. So far, I've been mapping it to something different. Like before, MySQL was listening on 3306 and I was mapping it to 3307. You don't have to. Just to show you that you can use the same one, I'm going to map it to 5432. So all that means is port 5432 on my Mac, in this case, is going to map through to port 5432 on the container. Yeah. So you don't have to pick a different one. It's just that if you want to, or if you need to, because that port number is already being used by something else, then you've got that flexibility. Yeah. So I'm going to listen on port 5432. Again, just like before, if we have a look over here, initialization scripts, it's going to be looking in the same directory. Actually, that's nice. They've got some consistency. Docker entry point initdb.d. It's going to look in there for any SQL files. Yeah, kind of the same as what MySQL did. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to map my local directory here, DB Postgres. I've got a similar database here called Pagilla. I've got the schema and then the data to insert. So I'm going to map this using a volume into that directory that it's looking for, that initdb directory, so that it'll create all the data for me. Yeah. Where was I? Here we go. So -v, my local file, my local directory, I should say, is hanging off the present working directory under DB Postgres Pagilla -0.10.1, and inside the container I want to mount that at Docker entry point, oops, Docker, not Dockers, Docker entry point initdb.d. Okay, so it'll go looking in that directory for any SQL files and find the ones that are in my shared volume. Awesome. Well, I want to start it as a daemon. Lastly, what image do I want it to use? I want it to use Postgres latest. Yeah. Let's see what my ID is. Docker containers list. Not containers. Okay, there's my ID. Let's just go and check, look at the log, make sure that it's ready to accept connections. There we go. Database system is ready to accept connections, but now it's Postgres. And again, I can jump over to FireDAC or in my application or whatever and test against that. So, you know, I don't care how great you've got your VM set up. You know, these things start, Docker containers start and stop so quickly that to me, this beats having a VM hands down. Yeah, I used to have a VM set up just to run, you know, this version of Innobase or this version of MySQL, and have another one for a different version and another one for a different type of database. And I'm loading up an entire copy of an operating system just to have a different version of a database. Yeah. Now, I can, once I've done the hard work of figuring out the environment variables to set and the how to get the data loaded in, then I can just start and stop these things in seconds. Yeah, and again, the memory overhead isn't that great because I'm not having a whole operating system loaded up just to run a database. Yeah, I'm leveraging the operating system of my host environment. Make sense? Okay. Let's just shut it down. Docker container stop. And again, we should see our Postgres messages on the way out. Cool.